I feel like every time we have these turnaround events, I have to explain the name, because it's an idea that came to me because we are looking for a turnaround, but it's interesting that in order to be able to have a turnaround as Christians, we need to repent. And repentance is the act of turning around, turning away from sin and going towards God and His righteousness. So if you want a turnaround in your relationships, then part of what or at least some of what I'm saying tonight could very well apply to you, and you might need to apply it to your lives. So the question I want to ask is, do you want a turnaround in your life? Do you want a turnaround in your relationships? Do you have conflict in your relationships? And if so, do you want to find out how you can resolve conflicts? I'm here to tell you that there is a way to peacefully deal with conflict in any relationship, any human relationship that you have. But with Valentine's Day tomorrow and all that sort of thing, you can focus it on your romantic relationship, but it really applies to any relationship. It's just that romantic relationships you're the most committed to, and you have more conflict as a result because you can't avoid the other person, and nor do you want to avoid the other person, but you are a different person. So we'll get into that in a moment. Firstly, I just want to share with you a couple verses from the scripture that really form the foundation for why we should care about peace. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." And the Apostle Paul said, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all people. So, as far as it depends on you, you have the responsibility to be at peace with all people. We should be pursuing peace as Christians. It's really part of our duty as Christians is to pursue peace and to ensure that there is peace in the world. Peace in our lives, peace in our families, peace in our community, and then hopefully one day peace in the world. We know that when Jesus returns there will be peace, but we're working towards it. So the responsibility for having peace rests with us. And it's up to each of us to ensure that we are at peace. And if having peace is up to us, then firstly we need to ask, what is peace? And how can we achieve peace? So firstly, I want to define peace. What is peace? Quite simply, peace is a lack of conflict. And I know that that's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's at least a good place to start. If you can start with peace being a lack of conflict, that's a good place to start. Because conflict comes as a result of the fact that we all don't have the same needs and desires all at the same time. Right? That we are individual people with our own minds, with our own wills, our own needs and desires, and those needs and desires don't always match up with others. So as we interact with other people and we realize, our needs and desires don't match their needs and desires, we realize that there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict with other people. Conflict in and of itself is not a bad thing. It just represents the fact that we're different. That's all, right? Now, let me say this. If you can avoid the other person, the person that has different needs and desires than you, conflict resolved, right? Or conflict avoided. If you can avoid another person who you know you're going to come in conflict with, then you've ensured that there's peace. However, not all of our relationships are like that, right? Sometimes we have committed relationships, like a marriage relationship or a family relationship or a work relationship. A work relationship is a little more flexible because you can always leave your job, but sometimes you want to keep your job, rightly so, right? So these are committed relationships, and it's a little harder to avoid conflict because you're going to run into people who have different views than you and different needs and desires. If that's the case, what's the solution? Well, there are two ways that you can resolve conflicts. Either through peaceful communication or through aggressive communication. There's really no other way to interact with others, either peacefully or aggressively. But before I explain what peaceful communication is or aggressive communication is, let's just look at what communication is. What is communication? For our purposes tonight, I'm going to define communication as the the transmission of information among people. That communication is the transference of ideas from my mind to another person's mind. That's a very basic definition of communication. And then we can ask this question. If that's what communication is, we would then ask, why do we communicate? And I found this quote on the internet regarding why we communicate. I thought it really did a good job explaining why we communicate. Communication occurs in order to survive in society. Sharing information makes life easier since we are able to share our thoughts and feelings, and it also helps us to form social bonds in society and to handle how others perceive us. Because human beings are social creatures, and we want to be able to understand other people, and we want others to understand us. And more specifically, when we communicate in order to satisfy an aspect of our self-interest. We communicate to get others to satisfy us in some way. So you might question that. So let's take a moment to think about that. As we go through life, each day and throughout each day, we will have various goals. No matter where you are in your life, you're going to have various goals. Even if your amazing goal is to wake up and go sit on the couch and watch TV, at least you have a goal, right? So no matter what, each of us has a goal. But in order to achieve those goals, most of the time, we need other people to help us achieve those goals. Of course, sometimes you don't need other people, especially if you're staying home or whatever. But if you're going out in the world, you're going to interact with other people, and you're going to need other people in order to help you achieve your goals. So, in order to achieve our goals, we transmit information from our minds to other people's minds that hopefully will get them to help us to achieve our goals. So why do we communicate? We communicate to let others know what we need. And need doesn't always refer to need in the absolute sense, like if you don't get this need met, then you're going to die. So perhaps a better word is desire. So I'll use both of those words just to communicate the fact that why we communicate is to get others, we communicate to let others know about what we need or desire. We communicate so we can get something from another person. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to communicate. Right? So what are some specific ways we communicate? I think this is pretty straightforward. That I'm currently communicating to you verbally, so we communicate verbally through body language. A lot of our communication is body language. Through writing, through music, and we could probably think of more examples, but those are the basic ones. And for our purposes tonight, we are just going to focus on verbal communication. Verbal communication in a relationship. So that's how we communicate, and we did answer the question of why we communicate, but let's discover some specific examples of how we would communicate or what we would need to communicate for. Remember, we communicate in order to get others to satisfy a need or desire of ours. But here are some specific examples. From your spouse, you want them to do the dishes. That's a basic, probably almost everyday attempt at communicating with your spouse, right? Or from your child, that when they're out, perhaps they're a little loud, and you want them to keep their voice down when they are in public. Or when you're at work, and there's a task that needs to be accomplished, that needs to be done, and your coworker does it one way, and you want them to do it a different way. And so you want to communicate to them that you want that task done differently. So, but these are just examples. It can literally be anything. So that's why I said that even though we're focusing on sort of romantic relationships, feel free to apply it to any area of your life. That's why I said on this Sunday, who here is in a relationship of any kind with any human being? And everybody put up their hand. I said, who here has conflict sometime? And we all have conflict no matter what our relationship is. So why is it then, if we want those things, using those three examples, if we want those things from your spouse or your child or a co-worker, how come sometimes what we get, when you ask your spouse to do the dishes, it can sometimes lead to a fight? Or why is it that when you ask your child to keep their voice down, it can lead to a tantrum? Or why is it that sometimes when you ask your coworker to do something differently, it can lead to resentment or worse? The interesting thing is, even though our goal in communicating, the whole point of communication is to get others to satisfy a need or desire, sometimes the way we communicate gets people not to satisfy us. The very opposite of why we communicated in the first place. It's the method that we use, the way that we communicate, is counterproductive. If people do satisfy our needs or desires, they don't do it because they want to do it out of love, but because of an obligation or some other negative feeling, right? Sometimes we get people to do what we want. Like that coworker who maybe begrudgingly does the task differently, but he didn't do it because he wanted to, but because he felt some negative emotion like shame or something like that. So why does this happen? Why do we communicate, or we attempt to communicate, and it leads to the very opposite of what we want? Or if it even does lead to what we want, it's not a very good, there's not very good motivation on the other person's part for why they are doing it. It all comes down to sometimes the way we communicate is aggressive. Sometimes the way we communicate with others is not peaceful. So I have to ask this question: what is aggression? Aggression, simple definition, refers to using force to get others to meet your need or desire. Remember, we all have needs and desires. We all have goals that we want to accomplish each and every day. Aggression is the use of force in order to get other people to meet or satisfy our need or desire. But let me clarify though, because there's at least there are two kinds of aggression. There's violent aggression and there's non-violent aggression. Violent aggression refers to using physical force, violence, right? Physical force to get others to meet your need or desire. So if you use physical force or the threat of physical force to get your need or desire met, then you are violently aggressing against others, right? Like, let's think of two obvious examples. If you wanted somebody's money and you threatened them with violence or you used violence against them, what is that called? And to get them to give you their money. That's theft, right? What about if you want them to do something for you? It's called enslavement. If you threaten someone or use violence against them in order to get them to do something, do a service for you, that's called enslavement. These are just the definitions of theft and enslavement. So this is aggression. This is violent aggression. And what is it about theft and enslavement? What is it that allows someone to be successful in getting people to do what they want? When they're using violent aggression, what is it that gets them, that allows it to happen, allows it to take place? Right? A person can only aggress against another person in this way because they have the power to do so. What is it that allows someone to get what they want through the threat of violence? It is power. Because a 100-pound weakling cannot get a 300-pound strongman to do what he wants. Right? The weakling can't threaten the strongman because the strongman will just laugh at him and won't do what he wants if he uses violent aggression. Right? The difference is in power. The strongman here has the power over the weakling. So he can use violent aggression against the weakling. Right? So we have a power struggle. In life, there are those who are more powerful than us, and they can get what they want through acts of aggression. And in the cases where in those cases where somebody uses violent aggression against others, there is one person who wins. The one with power is the one who wins. And the one without power, or with less power, is the one who loses. What is this called? This is called a win-lose interaction. The interactions that include aggression will almost always end in win-lose, will always end up as win-lose interactions. Now, hopefully here, no one here is engaged in violent aggression. In fact, if you are threatening others with violence, then I would call you to repent right now. That that there's no, we have no tolerance for those who are violently aggressing or threatening violence against others. I know all of you here, so obviously none of you are, but those who are threatening violence or who were the victim of that, they certainly know how immoral and how evil it is, and God does not tolerate it. We shouldn't tolerate it, and you should repent as a result. If you have done it in the past, you can still forgive, or you can still approach the person and ask for forgiveness and show your remorse. However, that's violent aggression. There's another kind of aggression that I think we're all guilty of, and it's non-violent aggression. We all non-violently aggress against others. In some cases, at some point in our life, we've all done this. We've all used power in order to get what we want. We've all used power in our relationships. Now, the majority of our personal relationships, because of that, because we've all used power, each of us, we've all been either used power against others or we've been the victim of those who are more powerful than us. Again, I'm talking non-violently. Because of that, our relationships reflect, to some degree, that win-lose paradigm. We constantly have win-lose interactions in our relationships. One party exerts power over another in order to win, causing the other party to lose, right? That's what a win-lose is. And again, we're not talking about violence, but we are talking about manipulation, right? We're talking about the power, emotional or psychological power that one person has over another, right? So the other person might do what you want. I mentioned this earlier. The other person might do what you want, but you've only won at their expense. That's because the other person's needs and desires have not been considered, right? In a win-lose interaction, one person wins because they've manipulated the other person, the person who's lost. And the person who's lost has only given the other person what they want because they've been manipulated. Their needs and desires have not been considered. So it is a win-lose. So, I want to show us some examples. Dave and Joanne have graciously agreed to show us some examples of win-lose. Just right there, and what I'll do is I'll hand you the... Okay, so the first example is of a spouse. Your spouse has agreed to do the dishes, but they are not done long past the time you thought they would be. So the spouse who asked the other spouse to do the dishes says this.
Dave, are you ever going to do the dishes?
Or,
why haven't you done the dishes yet?
Or possibly this.
Do you not care how I feel when you don't do the dishes?
So the spouse will then say,
Okay, I'll do the dishes already.
Or how about in a parent-child relationship? Your child raises their voice in public, so the parent says,
I can't take you anywhere.
Or,
I'm so disappointed in you.
or he might say this.
Why can't you just do what I say when I tell you to talk softer?
So the child, in a lot of cases, might actually just not say anything. Will just cower, and will just simply, out of shame, say nothing and get the point that way, right? Remember, these were examples where a person wins. And there's one more example, actually. Sorry about that. There's one more example. There's the coworker. Your coworker doesn't do a task the way you want it done.
Dave, you never do anything the way I want you to.
Or you might say this.
You're going to get us in trouble with the boss.
Or you might say this.
How did you ever get hired?
So the coworker might say,
Fine, I'll do it your way.
there you go. Thank you. So these were examples where one person wins and the other person does comply. I chose to show you what's like when the other person does comply and meets the other person's need or desire, but not because they really wanted to or that they feel like they've won. In fact, their needs and desires have not been considered. So it's really just a win-lose. The person who asked the other person to meet their need won because they got what they wanted, but the other person's needs and desires have not been considered, so they've lost. But we don't want to have win-lose interactions in our relationships. Let's strive for something better. In fact, there's sometimes when it's much worse than win-lose. It's lose-lose, right? What is a lose-lose interaction? There are times when you've asked the other person to meet your need or desire, and they don't do it. So you haven't gotten your need or desire met, and the other person certainly hasn't, and so it's a lose-lose. But we don't want lose-lose interactions. We want something better. I think you can see where I'm going with this. What's the solution? We should be striving towards having win-win interactions. In a win-win, remember in the examples, the person who won did have their needs or desires met, but only because the other person felt pressured or some other negative feeling, and therefore they complied to meet the other person's need or desire. The other person hasn't won in the interaction. And similarly, when you treat others that way and you comply with their wishes, you probably don't feel like you've won, right? When others sort of manipulate you into feeling a certain way and you comply with their wishes or with their needs to meet their needs or desires, you don't feel like you've won in that interaction. So the solution is, if we don't want to lose in these interactions, the solution is to peacefully communicate so that the end result is a win-win. A win-win interaction refers to a scenario that is free from aggression. A win-win interaction refers to a scenario in which all parties involved are satisfied and no party feels like they have lost. Or at the very least, that all parties at least find the solution acceptable to themselves, right? They might not be completely satisfied, though that is the ideal and that's the goal you should be striving toward. You at least find the solution acceptable and you consider it a win in that sense. So, how can we peacefully communicate? How can we have peaceful communication so that we can have those win-win interactions with others? Here are some tips. And I do have to say that a lot of the method that I'm presenting here is not my own, and it's something I've learned. I'm not bright enough to figure this on my own, but I'm grateful to God that we have discovered this method of communication, this sort of way about going about communicating with each other. And if you want more information about the source, now that I remember it, I actually have a handout for you. So for the purposes of sort of being on the same page with me, so to speak, I'm going to have somebody hand out these right here. Okay, you're going to notice when you get the page that there's 4 different steps that you can take in order to peacefully communicate. So how can we achieve peace? We can begin to communicate so that all parties are respected as individual persons, that they are worthy of respect and to be heard and considered. They are each deserving of their opinions to be respected and to be heard. So, what is this method of communication? Is there a way to get people to satisfy our needs while also getting their needs satisfied as well? Is that possible? Do we always have to win-lose? Do we always have to lose-lose? Can we have win-win? There is a way. And it's all actually based upon, after reflecting on it, it's all just based upon the golden rule. It's really just treat others the same way that you want them to treat you. Or the negative way of saying this, the way that Rabbi Hillel said it. He said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to others. So that's just the negative way of saying this. That treat others the same way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so the first step in being able to peacefully communicate, we need to stop judging others. We need to, in order to get to a win-win, we need to be able to not judge each other. In other words, when someone does something that displeases us, instead of acting like we know everything, let's hold off on judging the other person and instead take a moment, calmly seek to understand their motivation behind their actions. Because when we are quick to make judgments, we are assuming their motivation. We are assuming, in most cases, assuming the worst about them, right? So when we make assumptions, we miss out on what could actually be the reason, the real motivation behind their actions. And in fact, our judgment of the other person, making judgments of the other person, it just simply alienates them and causes them to not really feel comfortable enough to share with you their real motivation. So, when we make judgments, we never get to actually find out what it is they are feeling and what it is that is motivating them to act in that way or to not act in a certain way, as the case may be. So to begin to communicate in a peaceful way, if you're not going to make judgments, then what should you say? How about only say what is observable? Some of you who were here at, not last turnaround, but turnaround before, I did sort of share some of this information, but I felt that this was important enough to repeat, and it was important enough to elaborate on as well. So only say that which is observable, that which is seen, heard, and touched, or in other cases, tasted, or in other senses. The point is, that which is in reality, that which is not your personal opinion on what their motivation was, but only on what you observed, right? So, by stating only the observable facts, we are simply treating others the way we want to be treated. Because guess what? I don't like it when people think the worst of me or assume what my motivation is. I prefer that they only really say what actually happened and ask me what my motivation was, right? So the least I can do is to treat others that way and not make assumptions, not make judgments, and simply only bring up that which is observable. That alone, if we could just stop judging each other in that way, that alone would bring so much peace to our relationships. But that's really only just step one. If we can stop judging each other, we can then move on to the next one, which is we need to understand each other's feelings. In order to get to a win-win interaction, it's essential to discover the emotional motivation behind a person's actions or state of mind. In order to do so, how do you find out what another person is feeling? You have to take the time to figure it out. You have to pause, you have to assess what it is the other person is feeling, or if you're speaking for yourself, then you have to take the time, take a moment or two to ask yourself, what am I feeling in this moment? And you might not know what the emotions are right away. It might take you a bit of time to get skilled at discovering your emotions and really finding out what it is you're feeling when things happen, how you react to things. But guess what? The pursuit of knowing your emotions in and of itself is a great way to build closeness in a relationship. We know this firsthand, that us trying to discover our emotions and trying to, I'm not saying it has to be a one-sided conversation. The other person can ask questions. Are you feeling this? Are you feeling that? Right? Or if you're talking for yourself, you can say, oh, boy, I don't know what I'm feeling, but I think it might be this, and then you can think about it and try to figure it out. And in the process, but in this process, it's going to be really awkward, especially at the beginning. If you've gone your whole life and you haven't really given your emotions any thought, and you haven't really sought to discover what you feel when stuff happens, it's going to be really awkward at the beginning, right? And so the ideal situation is to let others know that that's what you're doing, right? If in that situation you are trying to figure out your emotions and the other person's like, what are you, are you in the conversation anymore? What's going on here? Right? So it's ideal to let everyone know, especially your spouse or whomever, people you're most close with, that you let them know that you are trying to discover your emotions. Because it's going to lead to being able to better communicate and peacefully communicate. So, it's going to require you to dig deeper. It's going to require you to figure out that, there are some emotions that are pretty straightforward, right? Sometimes you can figure out if you're worried or resentful or ashamed or disheartened or overwhelmed or insecure. These are some feelings that maybe might more immediately come to mind. But if you take a look at the handout, here's a whole list of emotions, right? Some of those emotions you don't, oh, I guess I do feel that emotion. You don't tend to think about that, right? So it's going to take some time to figure out and to really dig deep into yourself to find out what it is you're feeling in those moments. But here's a point I want to make, because I feel like this is not really understood, that emotions should be respected as something legitimate and worthy of knowing. That too many people attempt to bury their emotions, or they think that they're insignificant, right? But the reality is, this is science. The reality is that our emotions is our way, this is God's gift to us to allow our bodies to tell us when something's going on, right? It's a tool that God has given us to help us to understand reality, to help us understand ourselves in reality. And it helps us be on the path to get to the real solution of our problems. So, emotions shouldn't be scoffed at, they shouldn't be made light of, they should be respected as legitimate and worthy of knowing. And similarly, thirdly, the third step we need to take in order to be able to peacefully communicate, we need to understand each other's needs and desires. Now, what do I mean by needs or desires? Needs or desires, and especially if you look at the page and you see what I'm referring to there, needs and desires refers to the internal motivation behind why we do or do not do things, right? Things like acceptance and wanting to have peace in your life, and whatever it might be. These are all motivations that we have for why we do what we do or not do things, right? So needs are those things that are common to all people. All people are looking for acceptance, connection. You can see it on your page. Physical well-being, honesty, rest, joy, autonomy or independence, and so on. So when we understand the needs of others, and we realize, hey, they're a human being just like us, and if you claim to love that person, you're going to want to meet their needs or their desires, right? So it's important to take the time to find out what the real reasons are behind why we do or do not do things, right? And you'll see it in the example later. But I do want to make the similar point that I made about emotions, that it's important that we respect the needs or desires people have. Think about it, if we begin to put down other people's needs or desires, or when they begin to express their needs or desires, we say, oh, well, whatever, that's not really that important. But that's their need or desire. That's not for you to say whether it's legitimate or not, because you have your own needs or desires. How would you like it if they did that to you? So it comes back down to the golden rule. Treat others the way you'd like to be treated, right? So we want others to respect our needs and desires, so the least we can do is seek to find out what other people's needs are and their desires, and then recognize their legitimacy. I do want to be clear though, because you then might think, does that mean I have to agree with everything that other people do or want? No, I'm not saying that we have to morally accept what other people want to do, or like in terms of if they're doing something that we personally disagree with. I'm not saying you have to agree with them. Or even if it's something simpler than that. If it's just a different preference and you don't happen to like that preference or whatever it might be. You don't have to actually agree and say, yeah, me too, as if you're the same person. Because that's not what's important. What's important is that you at least respect their own right to try to get their needs and desires met. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the message, sometimes you can avoid conflict by simply avoiding the other person, right? But when you're in a marriage or in a family or in a work situation, it's tough to avoid other people, right? Or quite frankly, I don't want to avoid my wife. I like being around my wife, but there still is conflict, right? Because we have different needs and desires. That's not all at the same time. So in those situations, if you focus on and this is just a recap of what we've learned, if you focus on what's actually happened and you don't make judgments, and you seek to discover their emotions and their needs and desires in that situation, then you are well on your way to finding the solution to conflict. So lastly, number 4, after you've not made judgments and you've only said what's observable, after you've discovered their emotions or their needs or desires, you then can negotiate to find a win-win solution. And it's vital that you don't just assume that the other person knows what they need to do in order to meet your need or desire, right? Because how often do people sometimes assume things regarding what we should be doing, and then you say to them, I didn't know. How am I supposed to know? I'm not in your head. So the least we can do is to not let others assume that they know what they need to do, and we make requests. We make requests of them. But let me just say this, that requests are not demands. There's a difference between saying, do it this way, and can you do it this way? Right? One is the can, or do it this way, the demand. That's just setting up a win-lose, or possibly a lose-lose. But can you do it this way is getting you closer to a win-win. So by making a request, you are allowing the other person to then assess what their needs are, which will then allow both of you to come to a win-win solution. So at this point, once you've done all this work, you are then able to negotiate a win-win solution to the conflict. And you might not immediately know what the win-win solution is, but the beautiful thing about win-win and negotiation is that you can be creative. You know, who says that life has to be exactly the way it is right now? Why can't you change your life a little bit, right? So because you've done the work of finding out each other's emotions and needs and desires, you then have a better chance of coming up with a win-win. So let's have Dave and Joanne come back. We're going to return to those 3 examples, and we're going to find a win-win solution. Okay, so in the first example, the husband had agreed to do the dishes, but they have not yet been done. So the first spouse says,
Dave, when I see that the dishes have not been done, I feel anxious and overwhelmed because I need consideration and order. Would you be willing to do the dishes now?
because the wife has not once in this whole interaction so far, because she has not judged her husband, the husband at this point doesn't feel threatened, he doesn't feel shamed, or anything negative like that. Instead, the wife has simply said, let's have Joanne say it again. She simply stated the observable fact, she expressed her emotions, her needs and desires, and then she made a request. Let's have you do it again.
When I see that the dishes have not been done, I feel anxious and overwhelmed because I need consideration and order. Would you be willing to do the dishes now?
So this allows the husband to then be empathetic. He actually feels for his wife. And because he's not threatened, he can then share his own feelings and needs and desires.
I haven't done the dishes yet because I'm feeling a little burned out and I need some rest and some space. How about it if I do some of the bigger dishes now so there's a little more order in the kitchen tonight, and I'll do the rest of them in the morning?
The wife can respond.
That sounds good to me. You're considering my needs, and there will be some order in the kitchen tonight, and even more tomorrow. Thank you.
So, we have found a win-win solution to their problem. That the wife had stated that she wanted order and a little bit of, how did we put it? She was feeling anxious and overwhelmed, and she wanted to be considered. She wanted her needs to be considered in this situation, and she wanted order in the kitchen. So she asked, "Can you do the dishes now?" But Dave was feeling a little burnt out, a little overwhelmed. So, and he needed rest and some space. He didn't want to be overwhelmed with doing that task. So, but he was willing. This is where you can become creative. He was willing to say, "You know what? I don't mind doing a few of the big dishes now, but I'll do the rest tomorrow morning." And then Joanne realized, "Hey, wait a second. That means that there will be a little bit of order. He's certainly considering my needs and desires. There will be a little bit of order tonight, and then they will all be taken care of tomorrow." And if they're both satisfied with that solution, then it's a win-win, right? Okay. And so you're going to find that you're going to come up with your own solutions, and you can be creative about it. But the second example is that The parent wanted their child to not be so loud while in public. The parent says,
"When we're in public and you speak so that everyone around us hears, I feel uncomfortable and anxious because I need peace and cooperation. Would you be willing to speak so that only I can hear you when we're in public?"
Now I want to point something out. Notice that he said, when we're in public and you speak so that everyone around us hears. Because even saying something like, you're speaking loudly, is really just a judgment, right? Because loudness to one person is, like you come to our Italian house on a Sunday afternoon, it's pretty loud, but to us it's just normal. So even loudness and quietness is sort of a judgment call, right? We don't need to get too picky about all this stuff, all the terminology, but we do want to be mindful of judgmental language. So a good way of saying it, only stating that which is observable, is saying that when you speak so that everyone around us can hear, because that's a fact, everyone was hearing the child. And so say it again, go ahead and say your part again, David.
"When we're in public and you speak so that everyone around us hears, I feel uncomfortable and anxious because I need peace and cooperation. Would you be willing to speak so that only I can hear you when we're in public?"
So the child can respond.
Dad, when I speak so that everyone hears me, I feel excited and happy because I like to have fun and be paid attention to. But I can be quiet in public if you pay more attention to me and we have a little more fun when we go out.
The parent can respond.
"Of course I can do that, honey. I didn't realize that's what you needed."
Now, I might have us go over that again so you can really get it. But of course, I do want to point out, depending upon the age of the child, you're probably going to want to use a little more kid-friendly language, and obviously the child is going to respond in a way a child would respond. So you're going to have to, actually this is part of parenting, is you're training your child to be able to speak and communicate in a way that is not aggressive but is peaceful. So the point of this example was to show you that the child wasn't really interested in being loud for the sake of being annoying or obnoxious. The child didn't want to be annoying or uncooperative. He just wanted more attention from his parent. She wanted more attention from her dad. And because she wanted more attention, specifically attention from the parent, the fact that the parent did not demand silence or judge the child allowed the child to eventually realize and express the real reason why they were being loud in public. It's because they wanted more attention from their parent. So let's have you go over that again to really get it, the whole thing.
"When we're in public and you speak so that everyone around us hears, I feel uncomfortable and anxious because I need peace and cooperation. Would you be willing to speak so that only I can hear you when we're in public?"
Dad, when I speak so that everyone hears me, I feel excited and happy because I like to have fun and be paid attention to. But I can be quiet in public if you pay more attention to me and we have a little more fun when we go out.
"Of course I can do that, honey. I didn't realize that's what you needed."
So a win-win solution was found, because what kind of parent wouldn't, comply with the request to pay attention more to their kid and to have a little more fun? It's a perfectly reasonable solution, and it gets to the point that the kid doesn't want to be rebellious. No, but the child did have a need that wasn't being met, right? And the parent had a need too, so it's not a win-lose. We're not talking about the children owning their parents and walking all over their parents. We're talking about finding solutions where everyone is satisfied, so that everyone is considered and heard. That way, children can grow up thinking, I see this in the Fairbush kids a lot, children can grow up thinking that they're worthy and they're real people who are heard and considered. So I'm very grateful for the way Paul and Laura parent their kids, because you can just see the difference. But that allows for win-win solutions. And there's one more example. The co-worker, the person wanted their co-worker to do a task their way, but the co-worker did the task their own way.
Dave, when I see that you've done a task wrong, I feel frustrated and a little baffled because I need to be considered and be able to contribute. Would you be willing to try doing it this way?
"I did the task that way because our boss told me to do it that way. But I was aware of your ideas too, so I felt tense and conflicted. Because I have a need for peace and inclusion, would you be okay with presenting your ideas to our boss first? If he approved, then I'll gladly do it your way.
Which then allows the coworker to say this.
Thank you for clarifying that you are not intentionally ignoring me. I will definitely go to the boss first with my ideas. Thank you.
The second coworker wasn't trying to be rude or inconsiderate when they did things as the first person perceived it to be their way and not the other person's way. But it really just was the fact that the boss had said something. So this person had failed to mention that the boss had instructed him already to do it a specific way. But by speaking to each other this way, they eventually got to the truth. That it wasn't the one coworker trying to ignore or offend the other coworker. It was just that he felt obligated to do things the boss's way. But he also wanted to include the coworker too. So the solution was, I'll do it your way, but you have to sort of clear it with the boss first. And that, as a reasonable person, would say, well, I guess you shouldn't be doing things the boss isn't telling us to do, so I'll go to the boss first. So you can have a win-win solution. Let me see here. All right, let's give a round of applause to Dave and Joanne. Thank you. So, it is possible to avoid judgmental language. It is possible. Here are the 4 steps again. You have them on your page. I hope you can take that page home and begin to follow. If you have any questions about how to do it, we're not experts, but we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it's been working for us. I honestly would say that we haven't fought since we discovered this method. But not that we're big fighters before, but at the same time, when we have we still have conflict, but we don't fight because there's no reason to. Because we found a way that we can communicate and come up with solutions that are beneficial to both of us and satisfying to both of us. So there can be peace. There will be conflict, but there can be peace. And remember, earlier I defined peace as a lack of conflict, but again, there will always be conflict. So what we're striving toward, because we're each independent human beings with our own mind and with our own will, there will be conflict. But how we choose to handle the conflict is what can lead to prolonged periods of peace. So it is up to you. Let's have Joanne and Sarah come, and I'll show you how to get started on there afterwards. But it is up to you. Because as I mentioned earlier, there has to be a commitment to peace. Right? We have to be committed to peace as Christians. I mean, if we're not going to be the ones making peace in our relationships and in the world, who is? Right? We don't want to let non-Christians stumble upon the truth. We want to be the ones who know what we're doing because God has shown us. Right? All this stuff, this whole method is just people taking what the Scripture has always said and just finding a way to make it easier for us to understand. Right? Like every part of this method is simply the biblical way of communicating, made in a step-by-step sort of method. So we have to recognize people's emotions. We have to recognize them as being legitimate. We have to recognize their needs and desires and recognize those as being legitimate. And then each of us needs to ask God, here's the key, none of this works unless you ask God to give you a new heart and give you the desire to want to have peace in your relationship. So let's stand together. Let's take a few moments to sing a couple more worship songs that I hope will get our minds thinking about how much we need God to show us the right way, show us how we need His help, and He needs to give us a new heart in order for us to become peacemakers.
As the world gives to you, do I give my peace to you?